The United States government just made an impossible choice, an act of desperation to prevent one of its largest dams from catastrophic failure. The cost of this choice will be paid by 40 million people across 7 states. Their lifeline is a single river. Their future depends on 2 massive lakes. And the government just decided to drain one to save the other. This is not a drill. It is not a hypothetical. As of June 2026, federal water managers began choking the flow of the Colorado River, deliberately starving Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the nation, to prop up the failing water levels at Lake Powell, hundreds of miles upstream. They are sacrificing America's biggest water supply to keep the turbines at Glen Canyon Dam from spinning themselves to pieces in dry air. This is what a tipping point looks like in real time. Not a shortage, not a conservation notice. A triage. A decision about which part of the system lives and which part dies first. If you have ever wondered what happens when an entire region's lifeline begins to fail, your comments below help us understand what questions are most important to answer. This story is complex, and knowing what you are curious about guides our research. Let's begin. The engine of the American Southwest, the water that allows 40 million people to live, farm, and thrive in an arid desert, is governed by a system that is now mathematically bankrupt. And the laws that have held it all together, the fragile truce that has managed this collapsing resource for a century, expire in just a few months. The states have failed to agree on a path forward. The deadlines have passed. And the river is not waiting. A shocking number of people who watch our deep analysis are not subscribed. We get it. You click play and get absorbed in the story. But if this kind of work is valuable to you, taking a few seconds to subscribe is the single most important way to support this channel. It is a small click that makes an immense difference in our ability to produce these investigations. Thank you. So, the real question is no longer about drought. It is about what comes after. Did the government just delay a catastrophe? Or did they just accelerate a different one, pushing the entire Southwest one step closer to a future that has no water in it at all? The Colorado River was born from a lie. A beautiful, optimistic, and catastrophically wrong lie. The entire legal framework governing the most critical water source in the American West. The very document that dictates who gets water and how much. Was drafted on November 24th, 1922. It is called the Colorado River Compact, and it was based on a fatal flaw. The men who gathered to divide the river a century ago were statesmen, engineers, and visionaries. They saw a wild, untamed force of nature and envisioned a machine for civilization. A system of dams and canals that would turn the desert green and build cities in the sun. To do this, they needed to quantify the river. They needed to know how much water it produced each year so they could allocate it fairly among 7 growing states. They measured the river's flow during the early 20th century, a period we now know, through the undeniable science of tree ring data, was one of the wettest periods in the last 1,200 years. They measured a flood and called it average. Based on this unusually high flow, they allocated 15 million acre-feet of water per year between the upper basin states of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, and the lower basin states of Arizona, California, and Nevada. It was a gentleman's agreement written in ink, built on a mathematical error etched into the stone of American law. It allocated more water than the river reliably provides. It promised more than nature could deliver. This was not a mistake born of malice. It was a product of its time, an era of audacious engineering and a belief in human dominion over the natural world. This was the generation that built Hoover Dam, a monument of concrete and steel that tamed the river's floods and brought electricity to the West. They followed it with Glen Canyon Dam, which drowned a cathedral of a canyon to create Lake Powell, a massive battery of water and power for the upper basin. They saw a problem and engineered a solution. The solution was magnificent. The solution was celebrated. And the solution was incomplete. For decades, the structural deficit written into the 1922 Compact was a quiet problem, a line item in an accountant's ledger that never quite balanced but never triggered a crisis. The great reservoirs, Mead and Powell, were so vast that they could store years of the river's flow, masking the annual shortfall. They acted as giant savings accounts, filled during those unusually wet years and drawn down during the dry ones. The system worked. Until it did not. Beginning in the year 2000, the climate of the American Southwest began to shift. This was not a normal drought, a cyclical dry spell that would pass in a few seasons. Climate scientists now call it a megadrought, a 26-year period of aridification driven by rising global temperatures. The snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, the frozen reservoir that is the ultimate source of the Colorado River, began to shrink. The snow that did fall was melting earlier, and more of it was evaporating under a hotter sun, or being absorbed by thirstier, drier soils before it could ever reach the river. The inflows, the annual deposits into the basin's water bank account, started to plummet. But the withdrawals did not. The cities kept growing. The farms kept irrigating. The compact said the water was theirs. The system kept writing checks. But the river's account was running dry. The problem is, the entire region was looking at the wrong crisis. All eyes were on the iconic bathtub rings of Lake Mead and Lake Powell. The stark white bands of mineral deposits on the canyon walls became a global symbol of the disappearing water. News helicopters flew over stranded boat docks. Tourists took pictures of the canyons re-emerging from the depths. The crisis was visible. It was dramatic. It was on the surface. But the real catastrophe, the one that threatened to make the situation irreversible, was happening underground. Silently and visibly. Let me know in the comments if you were aware of this invisible crisis happening beneath the desert. It is a part of the story that rarely makes headlines, but it may be the most important part of all. While the Southwest was draining its visible lakes, it was also draining an invisible one. A new study released in late 2025 by a team at Arizona State University, led by former NASA senior water scientist Jay Famiglietti, used satellite data to look beneath the ground. What they found was staggering. Using NASA's GRACE satellites, which measure minute changes in Earth's gravity field to track the movement of water, they discovered the truth. Between 2002 and 2024, the Colorado River Basin lost 27.8 million acre-feet of groundwater. To put that number in terms that mean something, that is roughly the entire storage capacity of Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, vanished, pumped out of underground aquifers to supplement the failing river. While everyone was watching the bathtub ring grow, farmers and cities were drilling deeper wells, sinking straws into ancient aquifers, and pumping water that took millennia to accumulate. They were propping up a 21st century lifestyle with prehistoric water. And it was a one-time withdrawal. This is the hidden water debt of the Southwest. Unlike a reservoir, which can be refilled by a good snow year, these deep aquifers recharge on geological timescales, if at all. This pumping has consequences you can see. In parts of Arizona, the land is physically sinking as the water that once supported the soil is removed, a phenomenon called subsidence. It cracks building foundations, damages canals, and permanently reduces the capacity of the aquifers to ever hold water again. Jay Famiglietti issued a stark warning with the study's release. He said, and I quote, "If left unmanaged for another decade, groundwater levels will continue to drop, putting Arizona's water security and food production at far greater risk than is being acknowledged." It was an illusion of plenty, sustained by draining a savings account that no one could see, a desperate measure to meet the obligations of a 100-year-old promise the river could no longer keep. The surface crisis was a symptom. The groundwater crisis was the disease. And it reveals a fundamental truth about the entire system. It is not just in drought, it is in overdraft. A condition from which there may be no easy recovery. If you are finding this analysis valuable, taking a moment to like the video is a huge help. And sharing it with someone you know who lives in the West, or just cares about our shared resources, helps get this critical conversation started. It's a story that affects more people than most realize. This compounding crisis of surface and groundwater is colliding with a man-made deadline, a political time bomb set to detonate at midnight on December 31st, 2026. On that date, the current operating rules for the Colorado River, patched together in 2007 and again in 2019 to manage the escalating shortages, simply expire. Everything is on the table. The law of the river, a century of agreements and court decrees, will face its biggest test since 1922. The 7 basin states were given a mandate by the federal government: come up with a new, unified plan for the post-2026 world. A plan that accepts the new, drier reality and decides how to share the pain. They failed. The first deadline, set by the Department of the Interior, was November 11th, 2025. The states blew past it, deadlocked in bitter disputes. The core of the argument is simple and intractable. The upper basin states argue that the lower basin, particularly California, has been using more than its fair share for decades and must bear the brunt of the cuts. The lower basin states fire back that their water rights are senior and legally protected, and that the upper basin has a responsibility to deliver the water promised in the 1922 Compact, regardless of the climate. The federal government, under former Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner Camille Kalimlum Toton, had already sounded the alarm, famously demanding that the states find a way to conserve an unprecedented 2 to 4 million acre-feet of water annually. That is more water than Arizona and Nevada's entire combined allocation. It was a number so large it shocked the water world into silence. It was also a number that reflected the terrifying new math of the river. A second deadline was set for February 14th, 2026, a final chance to present a united front. Again, the talks collapsed. The divide was too deep. Tom Bushotsky, Arizona's lead negotiator, has been walking a tightrope, trying to protect his state from taking disproportionate cuts while acknowledging the brutal reality. As he stated, all of those who benefit from the Colorado River's bounty must share in the responsibility to preserve the river's health, but agreement on what that share looks like has proven impossible. So, on May 1st, 2026, the unthinkable happened. The lower basin states, Arizona, California, and Nevada, broke away. They abandoned the 7-state negotiation process and submitted their own joint proposal to the Bureau of Reclamation, a plan to manage the river by themselves for the next 3 years. It was a political fragmentation that water managers had feared for years. The consensus was broken. The basin was at war with itself. This puts the federal government in an excruciating position. The U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum, and the acting Bureau Commissioner, David Palumbo, are now overseeing a formal environmental impact statement process, evaluating 5 different alternatives for the river's future. One of those alternatives is a federal takeover. If the states cannot agree, the government will step in and impose its own cuts. This would trigger a legal firestorm, a generation of court battles that would pit state against state and farmers against cities, all while the reservoirs continue to drain. The ticking clock is no longer a metaphor. It is the sound of a legal system about to collide with a planetary one. And I know this is the second time I am mentioning it, but if you have watched this far and learned something new, we might have a connection here. If you still haven't subscribed, what are you waiting for? Our analytics show our viewers are brilliant and thoughtful, but also a little forgetful on the subscribe button. Please, take a moment. It is genuinely vital for our work. It was this political paralysis, combined with a truly disastrous winter, that forced the government's hand in the summer of 2026. The crisis at Lake Powell had become acute. To understand why, you have to understand the mechanics of a dam. Glen Canyon Dam is not just a wall holding back water. It is a massive hydroelectric power plant. Water from Lake Powell flows through giant pipes called penstocks, spinning turbines that generate electricity for millions of people. But those turbines can only function if they are submerged in water. The critical elevation for Lake Powell is 3,490 feet above sea level. This is known as the minimum power pool. If the lake surface drops below this level, the penstocks begin to suck in air along with water. This creates a phenomenon called cavitation. Air bubbles form and then collapse with explosive force against the turbine blades. It is the equivalent of running a boat propeller out of the water at full throttle. It can shatter the turbines, damage the dam structure, and cause a catastrophic failure of the entire power plant. Below that, at 3,370 feet, is dead pool, the point at which water physically cannot pass through the dam's outlets at all, cutting off the downstream flow to Lake Mead and the lower basin entirely. The spring of 2026 was supposed to bring relief. Instead, it brought horror. The snowpack in the upper basin, which feeds Lake Powell, was abysmal. The Colorado Basin River Forecast Center issued a forecast that sent shockwaves through the water management community. The April to July runoff, the period when the melting snow is supposed to refill the reservoirs, was predicted to be just 13% of the historical average. 13%. Instead of the usual 6 million acre-feet of water, the river would yield only 800,000. It was a number so low, it broke the models. Brad Udall, a leading water and climate researcher at Colorado State University, was blunt. He stated there is no historical analog for snowpack this year, and that the climate future looks awful. By June 2026, Lake Powell had sunk to just 24% of its capacity, its surface elevation hovering dangerously close to the 490-foot minimum power pool threshold. Projections showed it could crash through that floor by early 2027. The federal government was staring at the imminent failure of one of its largest hydroelectric facilities. So, they intervened. They enacted emergency measures. First, they slashed the scheduled release of water from Glen Canyon Dam down to Lake Mead, cutting it from 48 million acre-feet to just 6.0 million for the year. This would keep more water in Powell, propping up its level. Second, they ordered an emergency release of up to 1 million acre-feet of water from the Flaming Gorge Reservoir, far upstream on the Green River in Wyoming and Utah, to be sent down to Powell as a lifeline. This was the triage. To save Lake Powell's turbines, they had to starve Lake Mead. The consequences were immediate and severe. With its main inflow choked off, Lake Mead, the water supply for Las Vegas, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and millions of acres of farmland, began to plunge. New projections from the Bureau of Reclamation now show Lake Mead falling to a new all-time record low of 1,015.77 feet by July 2027. This puts Lake Mead on a terrifying trajectory toward its own dead pool elevation of 895 feet. Below that level, Hoover Dam becomes a useless concrete wall. No water for California's Imperial Valley, which grows a huge portion of America's winter vegetables. No water for the Central Arizona Project, the 336-mile canal that keeps Phoenix and Tucson alive. No water for Mexico. They are sacrificing the nation's largest reservoir to buy a few more months of power generation at the second largest. It is a zero-sum game played with the water supply of 40 million people. Complicating this impossible equation is a factor that for a century was ignored: the water rights of the basin's first peoples. Spread across the Colorado River Basin are 30 sovereign tribal nations. 22 of these tribes hold recognized, legally senior rights to a significant portion of the river's flow, up to 3.2 million acre-feet per year. That is somewhere between 22 and 26% of the river's true modern-day supply. For most of the last century, these rights existed largely on paper. The tribes were shut out of negotiations like the 1922 Compact. And they lacked the funding and federal support to build the infrastructure, the canals, pipelines, and treatment plants needed to actually use the water they legally owned. That water, unused by the tribes, simply flowed down the river and was consumed by the sprawling cities and agricultural districts of the lower basin. It became a hidden subsidy, a paper water right that propped up the thirsty growth of places like Phoenix and Southern California. That era is over. The tribal nations are now demanding a primary role in the post-2026 negotiations. They are rightly asserting that they will no longer be ignored, armed with legal victories and growing political power. They are calling for co-management of the river and demanding the resources to finally build the infrastructure to put their water to use. This is not a request. It is a legal and moral reckoning. But it introduces a devastating mathematical reality into the negotiations. The already shrinking pie of water is about to be re-sliced. As the tribes begin to use their senior water rights, there is simply less water available for everyone else. The water that cities have relied on for decades was never truly theirs to begin with. Every acre-foot a tribe rightfully claims is an acre-foot that a city like Phoenix or a farm in the Imperial Valley can no longer take. It makes the already impossible task of balancing the river's budget exponentially harder. This is the backdrop for one of the most maddening paradoxes of the entire crisis. While cities like Las Vegas and Phoenix are paying residents to rip out their lawns, and while reservoirs are approaching failure, about 80% of the Colorado River's water is used for agriculture. Much of that goes to thirsty, low-value crops like alfalfa and hay, which are grown to feed cattle. But it gets worse. A significant portion of that alfalfa, grown with the last drops of a dying river, is dehydrated, compressed into blocks, and exported to feed dairy cows in countries like Saudi Arabia and China. We are, in effect, exporting the Colorado River in solid form to foreign nations. It is a system that subsidizes the draining of a critical American resource for private profit and international trade, while 40 million Americans face the prospect of their taps running dry. The economics are as broken as the hydrology. Amidst this landscape of impending failure, there is a strange and revealing anomaly. The one place that should be the most vulnerable, a glittering metropolis built in the heart of the Mojave Desert, is arguably the most secure. Las Vegas. The Southern Nevada Water Authority, the agency that manages the Las Vegas Valley's supply, saw this crisis coming decades ago. While other states were fighting to protect their full allocations, Las Vegas was planning for a world with no water. They knew their two original intake pipes in Lake Mead, built at 1,050 and 1,000 feet, would one day be left high and dry. So they undertook one of the most audacious engineering projects in modern American history. They drilled what is known as Intake No. 3, or the third straw. It is a 3-mile-long tunnel drilled through solid rock deep beneath the floor of Lake Mead itself. Its opening sits at an elevation of 860 feet. That is 35 feet below Lake Mead's dead pool level of 895 feet. This means that even if the lake drops so low that Hoover Dam can no longer release any water to California or Arizona, even if the river effectively stops flowing, Las Vegas can still pump drinking water. It was a $1.5 billion gamble on survival. And it means that the last city drinking from Lake Mead will be the one in the middle of the desert. It is a testament to foresight and engineering, but it is a solution for one city, not for a basin. It secures a single tap, while the entire fountain runs dry. The desperation is palpable in other proposals as well. Arizona and Nevada have been in serious negotiations to fund the construction of a massive desalination plant on the Pacific Ocean in Mexico or California. The plan would be for these inland states to pay billions to turn ocean water into fresh water for coastal cities like Los Angeles or San Diego. In exchange, those cities would agree to leave an equivalent amount of their Colorado River water allocation in Lake Mead for Arizona and Nevada to use. They are trying to buy ocean water to save a river. This is the scale of the crisis. These are the solutions now on the table. They are breathtakingly expensive, technologically complex, and politically fraught. Okay, final reminder, and I truly appreciate your patience. We are a small team, and every single subscription feels like a vote of confidence. If this story has been valuable, if it has made you think, please consider it. It is the fuel for our next investigation. Thank you. So here's where we are. A river system in a 26-year megadrought. Two massive reservoirs at historic lows, with the government now forced to drain one to save the other. A hidden, underground water crisis that has drained an amount of water equal to Lake Mead, with no one noticing. A legal framework that is set to expire in months, with the 7 states that depend on it locked in a political civil war. And finally, the rightful claims of 30 tribal nations and the maddening export of water to feed foreign livestock, all complicating an already unsolvable puzzle. The future of the American Southwest now hinges on the next few months, on the decisions made in closed-door meetings by people like Interior Secretary Doug Burgum and the water negotiators from 7 states. Will the federal government be forced to step in and unilaterally impose cuts, triggering a decade of legal chaos? Or can the states, staring into the abyss, finally forge a consensus built not on the fantasy of 1922, but on the brutal reality of 2026? The engineering marvels of the 20th century, the dams and canals that built the modern West, were based on a belief in control, on the idea that nature could be bent to human will. The 21st century is teaching a harsher lesson, a lesson about limits. The story of the Colorado River is no longer about growth. It is about survival. The engineering saved Las Vegas for a time, but engineering cannot make it rain. It cannot fill a bankrupt river. And it cannot solve a conflict between 40 million people all laying claim to a resource that is actively vanishing. The question is, what happens when the water is gone? Is this a story about the managed decline of an American region? Or is it a story about a society finally forced to create a new way of life in the desert, one based on scarcity, not abundance? The choices being made right now, today,